Captain Sara Mitchell stood at the medical bay entrance watching. 24-year-old Corporal James Ramirez received treatment for what he considered minor wounds. The Marine brushed off the medic's concerns, flexing his bandaged arm with the swagger that only came with youth and invincibility. At 37, Sara had seen that swagger before. She'd worn it herself once, back when she believed protocols and textbook procedures could solve everything. Before Operation Sandstorm. Before she learned that some wounds couldn't be seen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. How's the arm, Corporal? Sara asked, her voice steady but kind. Fine, ma'am. Just a scratch, Ramirez replied, exchanging glances with his fellow Marines. I'll be combat ready by tomorrow. Sara nodded slowly, her hands clasped behind her. Back. She'd heard variations of this speech for 4 years now, ever since Colonel Blackwood had transferred her from combat medical operations to high-altitude transport duty. The official report had been diplomatic, exceptional medical service record, transitioning to specialized aerial evacuation role. The unofficial truth was simpler. After Sandstorm, nobody wanted the flight medic who prioritized psychological care alongside physical treatment. The body heals faster than the mind, Corporal, she said quietly. Take the full recommended recovery time. Ma'am, respectfully, when would that ever matter in real combat? This came from Sergeant Daniels, fresh from advanced training. His uniform still crisp with that new Marine shine. The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield explosion. When would that ever matter? Sara's fingers unconsciously traced the small silver caduceus pin on her collar, a souvenir from the day 14 of her unit members didn't come home. The day she'd treated both bullet wounds and panic attacks at 12,000 feet because sometimes the invisible wounds claimed more lives than the visible ones. Just follow the recovery protocol, she said. After the medical rounds, Sara walked alone across the frost-covered tarmac of Arrowhead Military Base. The January wind cut through her flight jacket, but she welcomed the cold. It kept her alert. Reminded her that comfort was a luxury military personnel couldn't afford. Her footsteps echoed between the hangars until she reached Hangar 5, where her C-17 Globemaster waited. The massive transport aircraft looked utilitarian compared to the sleek fighter jets the combat pilots flew. But this was her domain, the flying hospital she'd transformed from a basic transport into a sophisticated aerial medical unit. The cargo hold contained equipment she'd personally configured for high-altitude emergency treatment, arranged for maximum efficiency in crisis situations. Combat pilots might get the glory, but at 40,000 feet with wounded soldiers depending on split-second medical decisions, Sara knew that efficiency saved more lives than heroics. Carved into the metal beside the medical bay entrance, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were 5 words she'd etched herself: heal the seen and unseen. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been labeled too soft, too concerned with psychological trauma when the Marines wanted medics focused solely on patching physical wounds. But she'd seen what happened when the unseen wounds went untreated. Still fine-tuning that flying hospital, Captain? Sara turned to find Master Sergeant Elena Rodriguez approaching with a tablet in hand. Rodriguez was one of the few people on base who'd been there before Sandstorm, who remembered when Captain Sara Mitchell was the medic everyone wanted treating their wounds, both physical and mental. She keeps me sane, Sara replied, patting the aircraft's metal hull. Doesn't tell me I'm overthinking things. Rodriguez laughed, but it was hollow. You know, I pulled the after-action reports on the latest evacuation missions. State-of-the-art equipment, no question about it. But in the past 6 months, we've had 13 post-mission psychological incidents. Minor stuff mostly, but still, 13 incidents in 6 months. And how many on the transports that included psychological first aid? Sara asked. 2, both resolved. During the flight, Rodriguez swiped through data on her tablet. Makes you wonder if newer always means better. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the morning sun paint the mountains in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere in those peaks was Redstone Ridge, a name that had been appearing more frequently in intelligence briefings lately. Hostile territory, the report said. High-value reconnaissance targets. You ever miss it? Rodriguez asked. Being in the field, not just transporting the wounded after the fact. Sara was quiet for a long moment. The honest answer was complicated. She missed the clarity of battlefield medicine, the simple equation of keeping people alive until evacuation. She missed being trusted with something that mattered beyond transportation. Every day, she said finally. Rodriguez nodded, understanding. For what it's worth, Captain, some of us haven't forgotten. Some of us know what you did out there. After Rodriguez left, Sara climbed into her C-17's medical bay. The space was methodically organized, every supply positioned exactly where. Her muscle memory expected it to be. She pulled out a small metal case from beneath the primary treatment station, the same case she'd carried on every mission for the past 7 years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Inside was a handwritten journal, pages worn and edges soft from handling. The paper was stained with what looked like coffee, but was actually antiseptic solution from that terrible day in 2019. Actual grains of sand still clung to the corners, souvenirs from a desert that had claimed too many good soldiers. The journal contained her observations about treating psychological trauma in battlefield conditions, not the official protocols, but the improvised techniques she'd developed when terrified young soldiers needed more than bandages. These notes had saved lives once. She had a feeling they might need to again. The morning briefing droned on with the usual routine. Weather reports, training schedules, mission updates. Sara sat in the back row, half listening while younger medics discussed their latest procedures and theoretical emergency scenarios. The confidence in their voices reminded her of herself at their age, back when she thought surviving medical training meant she was ready for anything. Captain Mitchell. Colonel Blackwood's voice cut through her thoughts. I assume you have nothing to add to today's medical tactical discussion? The question carried an edge, a subtle reminder of her place in the hierarchy. She was here to observe, to perform basic transport duties, not to contribute to real operational planning. No, sir, she replied evenly. Nothing to add. But as she looked around the room at the faces of medics who'd never seen real combat, who'd never watched soldiers crack under the pressure of constant threat, who'd never had to choose between following protocols and addressing the invisible wounds that could kill as surely as bullets, Sara realized she had everything to add. They just weren't ready to listen. Not yet. The emergency klaxon shattered the morning quiet at 0600 hours. Sharp. Sara bolted upright in her quarters, instincts honed by years of combat operations kicking in before she was fully awake. Within 60 seconds, she was dressed, medical go-bag in hand, heading toward the command center. Muscle memory guided her through the corridors of Arrowhead Base. The scene in the command center was controlled chaos. Officers moved with practiced urgency between banks of monitors and communication stations. At the center of it all stood Colonel Blackwood, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, reviewing what appeared to be mission parameters on a large tactical display. Echo Squad is missing, Major Aaron Walsh announced to the assembled personnel. Last contact was 32 hours ago deep in Redstone Ridge. Intel suggests they've been compromised and are surrounded by hostile forces. Sara felt her pulse quicken. Redstone Ridge was nightmare terrain, jagged peaks, unpredictable weather patterns, and enough enemy activity to turn a routine reconnaissance into a death trap. She'd studied those mountains extensively after Operation Sandstorm, recognizing the similarities to the terrain that had nearly killed her unit. "This is a volunteer mission only," Colonel Blackwood continued, his voice carrying the weight of command. "High-risk extraction from a hot zone. We need a medical team for a specialized aerial evacuation. Reports indicate multiple casualties, with both physical and potential psychological trauma." Hands shot up around the room. Lieutenant Kim, Lieutenant Rodriguez, and 5 other medics from the elite Rapid Response Medical Team volunteered immediately. These were the base's golden children, the ones with perfect training scores and immaculate service records, unblemished by failure. Sara raised her hand. The room fell silent for a moment. She could hear nothing but the hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of aircraft engines warming up on the tarmac. "Captain Mitchell," Colonel Blackwood said, his tone carefully neutral. "I'm sure your transport expertise would be valuable, but this mission requires medical personnel with current tactical experience." "Sir, I have 32 successful combat medical evacuations logged, including 5 high-risk extractions in similar terrain," Sara replied, keeping her voice professional despite the implied dismissal. Lieutenant Kim cleared his throat. "With respect, Captain, those missions were years ago. This operation requires familiarity with current tactical protocols and modern medical procedures." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the younger medics. To them, her experience was ancient history, irrelevant in an age of computerized diagnostics and protocol-driven procedures. "The mission parameters are set," Colonel Blackwood said with finality. "Rapid Response Team will handle the medical aspects. Captain Mitchell, perhaps you could assist with pre-flight preparations for the transport aircraft." Dismissed. Again relegated to a supporting role while medics half her age prepared to fly into territory that had nearly killed her once before. But as she turned to leave, something caught her attention on the tactical display. The proposed flight path cut straight through Sector 9, a region marked in yellow for caution, variable atmospheric conditions. To the young medics, it probably looked like the most direct route. To Sara, who had memorized every pressure pattern and oxygen level in those mountains, it looked like suicide. "Sir," she said, stepping back toward the display. "The flight path through Sector 9. Current atmospheric data shows a massive low-pressure system moving through that region. It would be safer to—" "Captain," Colonel Blackwood interrupted, not looking up from his paperwork. "The mission has been planned by our best tactical analysts using the most current intelligence available. I'm confident these medics can handle any conditions they encounter." The dismissal stung, but it wasn't the words that bothered Sara. It was the absolute certainty in Blackwood's voice, the same certainty she'd heard before Operation Sandstorm, when her concerns about psychological preparedness had been waved away as unnecessary coddling. After the briefing, she lingered in the hallway, watching the chosen medics file past toward the preparation rooms. Their confidence was infectious, their camaraderie obvious. They moved like a team that had trained together, fought together, trusted each other completely. She'd had that once. Before Sandstorm. "Captain Mitchell?" Sara turned to find Lieutenant Jessica Parker, one of the base's intelligence officers, approaching with a thick folder in her hands. Parker was in her early 30s, career military with sharp eyes that missed very little. "Captain, I was reviewing the mission files and I noticed something interesting." Parker opened the folder, revealing what appeared to be classification. "Records. Your security clearance is still active at the H1 level." Sara raised an eyebrow. H1 clearance was reserved for medical personnel who had proven themselves capable of operating independently in the highest risk scenarios. She'd earned it after her 5th successful solo evacuation mission, back when the military still trusted her judgment. "That's unusual," Parker continued. "Most transport officers have their operational clearances downgraded, but yours was specifically maintained by order of Pentagon Command. I wasn't aware of that." Parker's expression grew serious. I pulled your complete service record. Captain, Operation Sandstorm, 2019. You were the only medic who successfully treated both physical and acute stress reactions during a high-altitude emergency evacuation after complete cabin depressurization. The memories came flooding back, the screaming wind, the plummeting oxygen levels, the weight of terrified soldiers in her care while she performed emergency procedures at 40,000 feet. The 3 she couldn't save haunted her dreams, but the 14 who made it home had families who would never know her name. That was a long time ago, Lieutenant. Was it? Parker pulled out another document. Because according to this morning's atmospheric analysis, the system moving through Sector 9 has the exact same characteristics as the storm that hit your transport in Sandstorm. Same pressure gradients, same oxygen density fluctuations, same potential for complete cabin depressurization. Sara stared at the meteorological data, her blood running cold. The numbers were eerily familiar, barometric pressure dropping at rates that would make staying conscious difficult without supplemental oxygen. Density levels that could turn a minor hull breach into catastrophic decompression. Have you shared this analysis with Colonel Blackwood? Parker's expression told her everything. I tried. He said the new C-130s are designed to handle any atmospheric conditions we might encounter. He's confident in the technology. Always. The answer until it wasn't. That evening, Sara found herself in Hangar 5 again, sitting in her C-17's medical bay with her old metal case open beside her. The handwritten journal seemed to glow in the dim light, its faded ink holding secrets that no medical database contained. She traced the protocols with her finger, not the direct approaches that looked logical on paper, but the winding, seemingly inefficient techniques that had brought soldiers back from the edge of psychological collapse. Methods that treated the mind as deserving of the same emergency care as the body, that recognized panic as a threat equal to blood loss. Her radio crackled to life. Captain Mitchell, this is Control. Please report to Colonel Blackwood's office immediately. Sara closed her journal carefully, locked the metal case, and climbed out of her aircraft. Whatever Blackwood wanted at this hour, it couldn't be good news. The colonel's office was spartanly decorated, military regulations, foundation certificates, and a single photo of him shaking hands with a Pentagon official. Blackwood sat behind his desk, reading from a tablet with the kind of expression that suggested he was delivering bad news. Captain, I'll be direct. There have been some concerns raised about your suitability for continued service in a transport capacity. Sara remained standing at attention. What kind of concerns, sir? Some of the younger medics have mentioned that your methods are unorthodox, that you focus too heavily on psychological intervention and emergency mental health procedures, instead of helping them master the standardized protocols they'll actually use in combat situations. Translation: she was teaching them to think for themselves instead of trusting blindly in procedures. Sir, I believe a comprehensive understanding of both physical and psychological emergency response. Captain, Blackwood interrupted. The military has evolved. We don't improvise anymore. These medics need to learn standardized protocols, computerized triage systems, and protocol-driven decision trees. What they don't need is someone filling their heads with ghost stories. About the old days. Ghost stories. Her 14 traumatized soldiers who'd survived because she treated their minds alongside. Their bodies had become ghost stories. I understand, sir. I'll adjust my approach accordingly. Blackwood nodded, seemingly satisfied. Good. Now about tomorrow's mission. I want you to understand that your exclusion isn't personal. It's simply that we need medical personnel who are current on operational procedures and familiar with modern tactical protocols. Of course, sir. But as she turned to leave, Blackwood added something that stopped her cold. Besides, this is exactly the kind of mission that separates the weak from the strong. These young medics need to prove themselves under pressure. Better they learn to handle adversity now than in a real war. Learn to handle adversity with the lives of wounded Marines hanging in the balance. Walking back across the base under a sky full of stars, Sara felt something she hadn't experienced in 4 years. The familiar knot of anticipation in her stomach that came before a high-risk mission. The same feeling she'd had the night before Sandstorm, when she'd known something was wrong, but hadn't been able to convince anyone to listen. History, it seemed, was about to repeat itself. The mission briefing began at 0500 hours with the kind of military precision that masked underlying chaos. Sara sat in the back row of the briefing room, officially there as an observer, but really present because Lieutenant Parker had requested her attendance for historical perspective. Colonel Blackwood stood at the front of the room beside a large tactical display showing Redstone Ridge in brutal detail. The terrain looked like something carved by an angry god, jagged peaks, narrow valleys, and enough dead zones to swallow aircraft whole. Echo Squad was conducting surveillance on suspected enemy installations when they went dark. Blackwood began. Satellite imagery suggests they're trapped approximately 30 clicks into the ridge system here. He pointed to a red dot surrounded by hostile indicators. Lieutenant Kim raised his hand. Sir, what's the current enemy presence in the target zone? Intel suggests moderate resistance, but the primary challenge will be terrain and weather. The ridge creates unique atmospheric conditions that can interfere with standard aircraft operations. Sara's jaw tightened. Interfere was putting it mildly. The ridge was a natural pressure cooker that could turn stable cabin pressure into a death sentence. She'd tried to explain this to Blackwood privately the night before, but he dismissed her concerns as outdated pessimism. Mission timeline is critical, Blackwood continued. Weather window closes at 1200 hours. After that, we're looking at 48 hours of severe atmospheric instability. If we don't extract the team today, they're on their own until conditions improve. 48 hours in hostile territory with limited supplies and unknown injuries. Sara had seen what 48 hours could do to wounded soldiers. The lucky ones didn't survive to be rescued. Flight path has been optimized for speed and efficiency. Major Walsh announced, activating a holographic route display. The projected path cut straight through Sector 9, just as Sara had feared. Direct approach through the ridge mouth, following the valley floor to the extraction point. The route looked perfect on paper, clean, direct, efficient. It was also exactly the kind of path that atmospheric systems love to turn into death traps. Sara cleared her throat. Excuse me, sir. I've reviewed the atmospheric data for Sector 9, and there's a significant low-pressure system, Captain Mitchell. Blackwood interrupted without looking in her direction. Your concerns have been noted and evaluated. Our atmospheric analysis team has determined that current aircraft systems are more than capable of handling any conditions we might encounter. Murmurs of agreement from the volunteer medics. To them, she was the paranoid old-timer who saw disasters lurking behind every cloud formation. Sir, with respect, the pressure gradients in that system are similar to conditions that can cause complete cabin depressurization. I've experienced. Captain, Blackwood's voice carried the kind of authority that ended discussions. These personnel are flying state-of-the-art aircraft with triple redundant pressure systems. Your experiences with older equipment aren't relevant to current operational capabilities. The room fell silent except for the hum of electronic displays. 7 young medics sat at attention, absolute confidence radiating from their posture. They believed in their training, their protocols, their invincibility. Sara had believed in those same things once. Very well, sir, she said quietly, settling back into her chair. The technical briefing continued with discussions of approach vectors, communication protocols, and extraction procedures. Everything was planned to the minute, coordinated with surgical precision, backed up by the most advanced technology the military could provide. It was a perfect plan that would work flawlessly, right up until it didn't. After the briefing, Sara approached Lieutenant Kim near the preparation rooms. The young medic was reviewing mission parameters on his tablet, stylus dancing across the screen as he made notes. "Lieutenant, could I have a word?" Kim looked up, barely concealing his impatience. "What can I do for you, Captain?" "I've flown missions in similar terrain. The atmospheric conditions in Redstone Ridge can be unpredictable. If cabin pressure destabilizes, if oxygen levels drop, do you know how to manage psychological responses alongside physical symptoms?" Kim's expression shifted from impatience to something approaching condescension. "Captain, respectfully, when would that ever be necessary? Our aircraft have backup systems for the backup systems. Complete depressurization just doesn't happen anymore. It happened to me. That was different. Older aircraft, outdated systems. The K-130s are. The C-130s are remarkable machines," Sara interrupted, "but they're still machines. And machines can fail when you need them most." Kim closed his tablet with a snap. "Captain, I appreciate your concern, but we've trained extensively for this type of mission. We know our medical capabilities better than anyone." The dismissal stung, but it was the absolute certainty in his voice that worried her most. She'd heard that same tone before Operation Sandstorm, from medics who believed so completely in their protocols that they'd forgotten to prepare for the moment when protocols weren't enough. 30 minutes before takeoff, Sara found herself standing on the observation deck overlooking the flight line. The C-130 sat on the tarmac, its sleek profile gleaming in the morning sun. Ground crews moved with practiced efficiency, conducting final pre-flight checks on an aircraft that represented the pinnacle of military aviation technology. Her own C-17 sat alone in Hangar 5, unofficial and unnoticed. "Second thoughts about retirement, Captain?" Lieutenant Parker approached from behind, carrying 2 cups of coffee that steamed in the cold morning air. "I'm not retired," Sara replied, accepting the offered cup gratefully. "Just reassigned." Parker nodded toward the flight line. "They're good medics, young, confident, well-trained." "Yes, they are." But Sara was quiet for a long moment, watching the ground crews complete their final checks. Confidence can be a liability when you're facing something you've never encountered before. These medics have never had their aircraft depressurize completely. They've never had to treat panic attacks at 40,000 feet. They've never... She stopped herself. Never had to fly home with the knowledge that some wounds couldn't be treated with bandages and protocols. The question hung in the air between them. Parker had read her complete service record, which meant she knew exactly what had happened during Operation Sandstorm. She knew about the 14 soldiers who'd made it home because Sara had treated their minds alongside their bodies. "I keep thinking about the atmospheric patterns," Sara said finally. "The pressure gradients, the oxygen density levels. It's so similar to Sandstorm." "Yes." They stood in silence, watching the final preparations. At exactly 0800 hours, the C-130 began its engine startup sequence. The sound was magnificent, a perfectly tuned aircraft preparing to demonstrate American military superiority. "Captain Mitchell, report to Colonel Blackwood's office immediately." The announcement crackled over the base communication system with unusual urgency. Sara exchanged a glance with Parker, both women recognizing the tone that meant something significant had changed. Blackwood's office was crowded when she arrived. The colonel sat behind his desk with his usual composed expression, but Major Walsh stood beside him looking distinctly uncomfortable. Most unusually, Brigadier General Carolyn Hayes was present, her star gleaming on her uniform collar. "Captain Mitchell," General Hayes said without preamble, "we've received updated intelligence regarding the extraction mission. The situation is more complex than initially reported." Sara remained at attention, waiting for details. Echo Squad wasn't just conducting surveillance. Walsh continued. They were investigating reports of advanced enemy chemical weapons in the Ridge system, specifically designed to incapacitate through both physical and psychological effects. The knot in Sarah's stomach tightened. What kind of effects? Sir, extreme anxiety, panic, disorientation, General Hayes replied. The kind of symptoms that could turn our most disciplined Marines into terrified civilians. Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his chair. General, surely our standard medical protocols. Colonel, Hayes interrupted. 3 hours ago, a reconnaissance team equipped with the same protective gear as our extraction team was sent into Redstone Ridge. We lost contact immediately. When we recovered the team, every member was physically unharmed but experiencing severe acute stress. Reactions that rendered them combat ineffective. Silence filled the room like smoke from a battlefield. Captain Mitchell, General Hayes continued. Your service record indicates extensive experience with battlefield, psychological intervention, and emergency mental health procedures. Have you ever successfully completed an evacuation mission with personnel experiencing acute combat stress reactions? Yes, ma'am. Operation Sandstorm, 2019. Hayes nodded. I've read the classified report. You treated 14 Marines for simultaneous physical wounds and acute stress reactions during cabin depressurization at 40,000 feet, after your entire medical team was either incapacitated or rendered combat ineffective by the emergency conditions. Yes, ma'am. The mission is a go in 20 minutes, Hayes said. But I'm making one change to the roster. Captain Mitchell, you're taking Lieutenant Rodriguez's position as medical team lead. The room erupted in controlled chaos. Blackwood leaned forward in his chair, his composed expression finally cracking. General, with respect, Captain Mitchell hasn't flown combat missions in 4 years. Her methods are unorthodox, untested in current conditions. This could compromise. Colonel, Hayes's voice cut like a blade. We have a team of American Marines trapped in hostile territory, facing enemies equipped with weapons specifically designed to exploit psychological vulnerabilities. I want a medic who can treat the whole soldier when everything else fails. She turned to Sara. Captain, you have 15 minutes to prepare. Take whatever equipment you think you'll need. As the general left, Blackwood stood slowly behind his desk. His face was flushed with barely controlled anger. Captain, let me be clear about something. You are medical team lead only. Lieutenant Kim maintains operational command. Your job is to follow protocols and provide support if needed. Nothing more. Understood? Yes, sir. But as Sara hurried toward Hangar 5, she knew that protocols and reality had a way of diverging when soldiers started breaking down psychologically. Her medical kit was already being prepped by Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had somehow anticipated this moment. The supplies looked basic compared to the advanced equipment the regular team carried, but every item had been meticulously selected and positioned for maximum efficiency in crisis situations. Sara circled the landing zone, studying the approach vectors with the kind of tactical analysis that came from years of impossible extractions. The wind patterns were treacherous, funneled through the ridge walls in unpredictable gusts that could slam an aircraft into the rocks without warning. But she'd landed in worse conditions during Sandstorm, when desperation had been the only navigation aid that mattered. Echo Squad, I'm coming in. Mark your position with smoke if you have it. The approach required everything she'd learned about flying in conditions that shouldn't be survivable. No computer assistance, no automated landing systems, just pilot instinct and the kind of experience that came from surviving what others didn't. Her C-130 dropped toward the ridge floor like a controlled crash, wind shear threatening to tear the aircraft apart while Sara fought to maintain approach speed. At 100 feet above the deck, enemy fire erupted from concealed positions in the ridge. Walls, muzzle flashes that lit up the shadows like deadly fireflies. Bullets punched through her wing panels, sending hydraulic fluid streaming behind the aircraft in thin trails of silver. Warning lights blazed across her instrument panel, like a Christmas tree, but the engines continued to run strong, and the controls responded to her touch. 30 seconds! She shouted into her radio as the aircraft settled toward the improvised landing zone. The C-130 hit the ground hard, bouncing twice before settling on terrain that looked like the surface of an alien planet. Before the engines had fully spooled down, Sara was out of the cockpit and running toward the cargo ramp, medical kit already strapped to her back. Echo Squad was taking cover behind a cluster of boulders, 8 Marines in various states of injury and exhaustion. Their team leader, a grizzled sergeant with blood seeping through a field dressing on his arm, looked at her with the kind of amazement usually reserved for miracles. "You're the medic from the radio?" "That's right, Sergeant." "Let's get you people home." Sara's assessment was rapid but thorough. 4 Marines with physical injuries, 2 serious, 2 moderate. But what caught her trained eye immediately was what the standard medical protocols would have missed. All 8 showed signs of psychological exposure. Dilated pupils, trembling hands, hypervigilance that went beyond normal combat awareness. "Were you exposed to any chemical agents?" she asked the sergeant as she began treating his arm wound. His eyes darted nervously. "How did you know?" "Your teen's showing classic signs of chemical-induced anxiety." "When did exposure occur?" "Yesterday. Enemy deployed some kind of gas. Our masks seemed to work, but afterward, everyone started getting jumpy, paranoid. 2 of my people nearly shot each other during a perimeter check. They swore they were seeing enemies that weren't there." Sara nodded, already pulling specialized medications from her kit. Medications that weren't part of the standard loadout, but that she'd insisted on bringing. "I'm going to administer a counteragent. It won't eliminate the symptoms completely, but it should reduce the paranoia enough to get you home safely." Loading the wounded Marines into her cargo bay required every bit of medical skill she possessed. The psychological symptoms complicated everything. Patients flinching away from helping hands, seeing threats in every shadow. But Sara had dealt with this before. She knew how to speak calmly through the fear, how to establish trust with traumatized soldiers who couldn't trust their own senses. "Ma'am," the sergeant said as they prepared for takeoff, "we heard the other aircraft go down. Are you sure this old bird can get us out of here?" Sara looked at her battered C-130, wings punctured by enemy fire, hydraulic fluid leaking from multiple hits, warning lights indicating system failures throughout the aircraft. By any reasonable standard, attempting takeoff was suicide. "Sergeant," she replied, "I've gotten people out of worse situations than this." The takeoff was a controlled disaster. Overloaded and damaged, the C-130 struggled to achieve lift in the thin mountain air, while enemy fire continued to rake the ridge floor. Sara pushed the throttles beyond their redline limits, coaxing every ounce of performance from an aircraft that should have been retired years ago. But as they climbed away from the extraction zone, she heard something that made every risk worthwhile: the sound of wounded Marines, beginning to breathe normally as her treatments took effect, the quiet murmurs of men realizing they would live to see another day. The flight back to Arrowhead Base was a masterclass in flying damaged aircraft through impossible conditions. With multiple system failures and limited cabin pressure integrity, Sara had to navigate by instinct while simultaneously treating both the physical and psychological wounds of her patients. Her handwritten journal proved invaluable, showing the safe corridors through the mountains that her instruments couldn't detect. Every landmark was exactly where her faded ink had marked it. Every pressure pattern behaved according to the notes she'd scribbled in the margins during her first flight through this terrain. "Arrowhead Control, this is medical lead requesting immediate medical assistance upon landing. 8 souls on board, 4 requiring urgent physical care, all showing signs of chemical exposure." The response came immediately, filled with barely Controlled emotion. Medical lead, confirm your position. We show no other aircraft from your mission returning. Arrowhead Control, I'm 10 miles out on final approach. The extraction was successful, but I need decontamination teams standing by. As her C-130 limped toward the runway, Sara could see emergency vehicles positioning themselves for her landing. The entire base seemed to be watching as the only aircraft to return from the mission approached through smoke and damaged systems. The landing was harder than she would have preferred, but her aircraft held together long enough to get everyone home alive. As the wounded Marines were transferred to waiting medical teams, Sara remained in her cockpit for a moment, hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion. She'd done it again, brought everyone home when technology failed and superior equipment became worthless metal. But this time, the victory felt different. This time, people had seen what happened when experience trumped innovation, when the soft approach to medicine proved to be the only one that actually worked. Colonel Blackwood arrived at her aircraft within minutes, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Behind him came General Hayes, whose expression was entirely unreadable. "Captain Mitchell," Blackwood began, "I need a full debrief on what happened out there." The atmospheric disturbance was more severe than anticipated. "The pressure systems were exactly as I predicted, sir," Sara replied, climbing down from her cockpit. The K-130's environmental controls were overwhelmed, but manual backup systems remained functional. General Hayes stepped forward. "Captain, are you saying that our most advanced aircraft were defeated by weather?" "No, ma'am. They were defeated by over-reliance on technology that wasn't designed to operate in those specific atmospheric conditions. The aircraft themselves are excellent machines, but their crews weren't prepared for complete environmental system failure." The general nodded slowly. "And you were prepared?" Sara pulled out her metal case, opening it to reveal the handwritten journal that had guided her through impossible terrain twice in 4 years. The ink was more faded now, stained with antiseptic from today's mission, but every line remained accurate. "Yes, ma'am. I was prepared." The debriefing room fell silent as Sara finished her detailed account of the mission. General Hayes sat at the head of the conference table, surrounded by colonels, intelligence officers, and medical analysts who had spent the past 4 hours trying to understand how 7 advanced aircraft had been lost while one with basic backup systems had completed the mission successfully. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Captain," General Hayes said, reviewing her notes. "The C-130s experienced complete environmental system failure due to atmospheric pressure anomalies that your aircraft was able to withstand?" "Not withstand, ma'am. Work around. My section's backup systems are largely mechanical and analog, which made them less susceptible to cascading failures. But the primary factor was medical methodology." Colonel Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Captain, are you suggesting that our tactical planning was inadequate?" Sara pulled out her metal case and spread the handwritten journal on the conference table. To the assembled officers, it looked like something from a museum. Faded ink, worn edges, actual sand grains embedded in the paper from Operation Sandstorm. "Sir, this journal shows atmospheric conditions and psychological response patterns that don't appear in digital databases. Pressure systems that change seasonally, chemical agent effects that shift based on altitude, stress responses that can turn disciplined soldiers into panicked civilians." Lieutenant Parker, who had been quietly taking notes throughout the debriefing, leaned forward. "Captain, how did you acquire this level of detailed knowledge?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield explosion. Sara traced one of the treatment protocols with her finger, remembering the desperate procedures that had saved 14 lives during Operation Sandstorm. "Experience, Lieutenant. 4 years ago, I treated soldiers under similar conditions when my unit was hit by similar atmospheric interference and exposed to enemy chemical agents. 14 Marines survived because I treated their psychological symptoms alongside their physical wounds. And you documented these treatment protocols? I documented everything. Every pressure change, every psychological symptom, every treatment that worked when standard protocols failed. I knew that someday someone else might need this information. General Hayes studied the journal intently. Captain, this level of detail, this isn't standard military documentation. This looks like the work of someone who expected to fly this terrain again. Yes, ma'am. After Sandstorm, I studied these mountains extensively. I knew the military would eventually return to this region, and I wanted to be prepared. Major Walsh, who had been silent throughout most of the debriefing, finally spoke. Captain Mitchell, are you saying that you've been maintaining this intelligence database on your own initiative for 4 years? Yes, sir, while assigned to transport duty. Yes, sir. The room fell quiet as the implications sank in. For 4 years, while the base's leadership had dismissed her as an outdated relic with a soft approach to military medicine, Sara had been quietly preparing for exactly the kind of mission that had just claimed 7 aircraft. General, Colonel Blackwood interjected, I think we need to focus on the immediate tactical situation. We have 7 missing aircraft and, Colonel, General Hayes interrupted, we have 7 aircraft missing because our tactical planning failed to account for conditions that Captain Mitchell predicted and prepared for. I want to understand how that happened. Lieutenant Parker opened a thick folder filled with atmospheric data. Ma'am, I've been reviewing the environmental analysis that supported the original mission planning. The pressure anomalies we encountered today were 4 times more severe than our computer models predicted, but Captain Mitchell's analysis was accurate. Her handwritten notes show atmospheric patterns that match exactly what we experienced in the field. She predicted the pressure zones, the intensity levels, even the specific altitudes where systems would fail. Colonel Blackwood's face was flushed with barely controlled anger. With respect, General, we can't base military planning on handwritten notes and anecdotal experience. We have sophisticated computer models, satellite data, real-time intelligence feeds, all of which failed catastrophically today. General Hayes replied coldly, while Captain Mitchell's anecdotal experience enabled her to complete the mission successfully and save 8 Marines. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sara remained silent, letting the facts speak for themselves. She'd learned during Operation Sandstorm that defending yourself too vigorously often made you look guilty of the accusations being made. Captain, General Hayes continued, I want you to walk me through your decision-making process during the mission. When did you realize the other aircraft were in trouble? Approximately 23 minutes into the flight, when we entered the outer edge of the atmospheric disturbance zone. The Co-130's environmental systems began failing in exactly the pattern I had experienced during Sandstorm. And your response? I recommended immediate course correction to avoid the worst pressure anomalies, but operational command was maintained by Lieutenant Kim as per mission parameters. Colonel Blackwood leaned forward aggressively. Captain, are you criticizing Lieutenant Kim's command decisions? Sara met his gaze steadily. No, sir. Lieutenant Kim followed the mission plan exactly as briefed. The fault wasn't in the execution. It was in the planning assumptions. What do you mean? The mission plan assumed that modern aircraft systems would be sufficient to handle any atmospheric conditions we might encounter. That assumption proved incorrect. Lieutenant Parker consulted her notes. Captain, during your pre-mission briefings, did you attempt to share your terrain knowledge with the other medical teams? Yes, Lieutenant. I recommended alternative flight paths and suggested the teams prepare for psychological symptoms in case of chemical exposure. And the response? Sara glanced at Colonel Blackwood before answering. The recommendations were noted, but not incorporated into the official mission plan. The teams were confident that their training and equipment would be sufficient. General Hayes's expression was unreadable. Captain, in your professional opinion, Could today's losses have been prevented? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Sara knew that her answer would determine not just her own future, but potentially the careers of everyone in the room. Yes, ma'am. If the mission plan had incorporated alternative navigation methods and prepared for psychological casualties, alongside physical ones, all aircraft could have reached the extraction point safely. Based on information that you possessed but was not included in the official briefing? Yes, ma'am. Colonel Blackwood stood abruptly. General, I object to this line of questioning. Captain Mitchell is essentially claiming that her personal theory should have overridden established military planning procedures. We can't run operations based on the hunches of individual officers. Colonel, General Hayes replied, Captain Mitchell's hunches resulted in a successful extraction, while our established procedures resulted in 7 lost aircraft. I'm beginning to think we need to reconsider which approach is more reliable. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with technical experts analyzing every aspect of the mission failure. But the core issue remained simple. Experience had triumphed over technology, and the military's most sophisticated aircraft had been defeated by conditions that one pilot with a handwritten journal had navigated successfully. As the debriefing finally concluded, General Hayes approached Sara privately. Captain, I'm recommending you for immediate restoration to active combat medical status. We need officers who can operate when everything else fails. Thank you, ma'am. But I need to ask you something directly. Why didn't you fight harder to get your intelligence included in the mission planning? Sara was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. General, I've learned that sometimes people need to see failure before they're willing to consider alternatives. I hoped I was wrong about the conditions we'd encountered today, but you knew you weren't wrong. Yes, ma'am. I knew. That evening, word spread quickly through Arrowhead Base about the day's events. The impossible had happened. The dismissed transport officer with the soft approach to military medicine had succeeded where the elite medical teams had failed. Medics who had dismissed her as outdated were now quietly asking technical questions about psychological first aid and manual pressure regulation. Sara found herself in Hangar 5, performing post-flight maintenance on her battered C-130. The aircraft looked like it had been through a war, with bullet holes, pressure leaks, and system damage that would require weeks to repair properly. But it had brought everyone home. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached with a cup of coffee and a satisfied expression. Heard you had an interesting day, Captain. You could say that. Also heard that some people are finally starting to ask the right questions about why our most advanced aircraft couldn't handle what your approach took in stride. Sara accepted the coffee gratefully. Technology's only as good as the people who understand its limitations, Sergeant. Today we learned that our limitations were more severe than anyone wanted to admit. As she worked on her aircraft, Sara reflected on the day's events. 7 crews were missing, possibly dead, because the military had chosen to trust computers over experience. But 8 Marines were alive because one medic had remembered that the human mind sometimes needed as much emergency care as the human body. The victory felt hollow, but it was a victory nonetheless. And for the first time in 4 years, people were finally ready to listen to what she had been trying to tell them. The emergency meeting convened at 0600 hours sharp, 12 hours after Sara's successful return from Redstone Ridge. General Hayes had flown in additional specialists overnight, bringing with her a team of investigators whose presence suggested that today's events would have consequences far beyond Arrowhead Base. Sara sat in the conference room's front row, still wearing her flight suit from the previous day's mission. Around her, the atmosphere was tense with the kind of energy that preceded major changes in military policy. Colonel Blackwood sat across the table, his face a mask of professional composure that couldn't quite hide his underlying anxiety. Ladies and gentlemen, General Hayes began. We're here to conduct a comprehensive review of yesterday's mission failure and to address Systemic issues in our tactical planning procedures. The phrase systemic issues carried weight in military circles. It meant that someone's career was about to end, and fingers were pointing in multiple directions. Captain Mitchell, Hayes continued, please provide the investigation team with a complete tactical analysis of the atmospheric conditions you encountered. Sara opened her metal case and spread her handwritten journal on the conference table. To the assembled investigators, the faded document looked like an artifact from a bygone era, which in many ways it was. The pressure anomalies began at approximately these coordinates, she said, pointing to a section marked with careful notations. Intensity increased exponentially as we approached the ridge system, reaching levels that overwhelmed modern environmental systems but were consistent with patterns I documented during Operation Sandstorm. Brigadier General Thomas Anderson, one of Hayes's investigators, leaned forward to examine the journal more closely. Captain, this level of detail. When did you create this documentation? The original mapping was completed in 2019, sir. I've been updating it quarterly based on seasonal weather patterns and solar activity data. You've been maintaining independent intelligence files for 4 years? Yes, sir. Colonel Blackwood cleared his throat. General Anderson, I should point out that Captain Mitchell's personal research project was conducted without official approval or oversight. These documents haven't been validated by our intelligence analysts. The implication was clear. Sara had been operating outside established protocols, conducting unauthorized intelligence gathering that could potentially compromise operational security. Colonel, General Hayes replied icily, Captain Mitchell's unauthorized intelligence proved more accurate than our official analysis. Perhaps we should be asking why our established systems failed so completely. Lieutenant Parker, who had been reviewing technical data at the back of the room, approached with a thick folder. General, I've completed a comparative analysis of Captain Mitchell's terrain documentation versus our official intelligence databases. Your findings? The data is not only accurate, it's more comprehensive than anything in our current systems. She identified atmospheric anomalies, seasonal pressure patterns, and terrain features that don't appear in any official military mapping. Colonel Blackwood's expression darkened. Lieutenant, are you suggesting that Captain Mitchell's personal files are more reliable than Pentagon-approved intelligence databases? I'm suggesting that her files contain critical information that doesn't exist anywhere else in our intelligence network. The room fell silent as the implications settled. For 4 years, while the military had invested billions in sophisticated intelligence gathering systems, one dismissed officer had been quietly assembling more accurate tactical information, using nothing but personal observation and careful documentation. Captain Mitchell, General Anderson said, I need to understand your methodology. How did you acquire intelligence data that our official systems missed? Sara chose her words carefully. Sir, I spent extensive time studying this terrain after Operation Sandstorm because I knew the military would return here eventually. I used personal leave time to conduct observational flights, correlated weather data with psychological response patterns, and documented connections that weren't captured in standard reconnaissance reports. Personal leave time? Yes, sir. I used my own time and resources to conduct intelligence gathering that I believed would be valuable for future operations. The investigators exchanged glances. What Sara was describing went far beyond normal. Officer dedication. It bordered on obsession, with a level of detail that professional intelligence analysts had missed. Captain, Colonel Blackwood interjected, did you attempt to share this intelligence with appropriate command authorities? The question was a trap, and everyone in the room knew it. If Sara said yes, Blackwood could argue that proper channels had been followed and the intelligence had been rejected for valid reasons. If she said no, he could claim she had been deliberately withholding critical information. Sir, I made several attempts to brief command staff on terrain conditions and psychological response patterns in the Redstone Ridge region. These briefings were noted, but not incorporated into operational planning. Why not? Sara glanced around the room, seeing career military officers who had built their reputations on following established procedures and trusting institutional systems. Because my recommendations were based on personal experience rather than official intelligence. Sources: Command preferred to rely on computer models and standardized protocols. General Hayes leaned forward. Captain, in your opinion, why did our official intelligence fail to identify the atmospheric conditions and psychological factors that brought down 7 aircraft? Another loaded question. Sara's answer would either validate the military's intelligence-gathering methods or expose fundamental flaws in billion-dollar systems. Ma'am, artificial intelligence focuses on broad regional patterns using satellite data and computer modeling. These methods are excellent for strategic planning, but can miss localized phenomena that require direct observation to detect, such as the atmospheric anomalies and psychological stress responses I documented. Yes, ma'am. The pressure patterns in Redstone Ridge are caused by unique geological formations interacting with seasonal weather systems. This creates atmospheric anomalies that shift quarterly and can't be predicted by standard meteorological models. Similarly, the psychological effects of combat stress and chemical exposure manifest differently at high altitudes than at ground level. These patterns require direct observation by someone with both medical and tactical training. General Anderson consulted his notes. Captain, you're describing conditions that would require years of interdisciplinary observation to map accurately. How long have you been studying this region? 4 years, sir. And during this time, you've been officially assigned to transport duty? Yes, sir. Colonel Blackwood saw his opening. General, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Captain Mitchell has been conducting unauthorized intelligence operations while assigned to non-operational duties. This raises serious questions about proper chain of command and operational security. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield explosion. Blackwood was suggesting that Sara had been operating as a rogue agent, conducting unauthorized reconnaissance that could potentially compromise military operations. Colonel, General Hayes replied, Captain Mitchell's unauthorized operations consisted of using personal time to study terrain and psychological response patterns that subsequently proved critical to mission success. Are you seriously suggesting that was improper? I'm suggesting that we have established procedures for intelligence gathering and operational planning. When individual officers decide to operate outside these procedures, it creates risks that could compromise larger operations. Sara remained silent, letting Blackwood dig his own grave. She'd learned during Operation Sandstorm that sometimes the best defense was allowing your opponents to reveal their priorities. Captain Mitchell, General Anderson said, did you ever consider submitting your intelligence findings through official channels? I made several attempts, sir. However, my reports were consistently rejected because they contradicted established intelligence assessments and medical protocols. Rejected by whom? Sara glanced at Colonel Blackwood. By base command, sir. The room fell silent, except for the scratch of pens as investigators made notes. Blackwood's face was flushed with barely controlled anger, but he couldn't deny the facts without lying to Pentagon investigators. Lieutenant Parker approached with another folder. General, I've reviewed Captain Mitchell's attempted briefings over the past 4 years. She submitted 17 separate reports regarding atmospheric anomalies and psychological stress patterns in the Redstone Ridge region. All were rejected with notations that they contradicted official intelligence assessments and standard medical protocols. 17 reports? Yes, ma'am. Each one predicted the exact conditions that caused yesterday's mission failure. General Hayes's expression was unreadable. Colonel Blackwood, why were these reports rejected? Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. General, we received numerous reports from various sources. We can't incorporate every individual officer's theories into operational planning without proper validation through official channels, even when those theories prove accurate. General, we had no way of knowing they would prove accurate at the time. It was the wrong answer, and everyone in the room knew it. Blackwood had essentially admitted that the military had chosen to ignore accurate intelligence because it came from the wrong source. Captain Mitchell, General Hayes said, if you had been included in yesterday's mission planning, could the aircraft losses have been prevented? Yes, ma'am. The atmospheric anomalies I documented could have been avoided with alternative flight paths that would have added only 80 minutes to the mission timeline. The psychological symptoms could have been anticipated and treated with protocols I developed. During Operation Sandstorm, 18 minutes? Yes, ma'am. General Anderson leaned back in his chair. So we lost 7 aircraft and crews to save 18 minutes of flight time and avoid using soft medical approaches. The question echoed through the conference room like a gunshot. 7 families would be grieving because the military had chosen efficiency over experience, standard protocols over psychological awareness. Captain, General Hayes continued, I want your professional assessment. How many of our current operational plans might be based on similar intelligence failures? It was the question that would change everything. Sara knew that her answer would either validate decades of military planning or expose systematic flaws. That could affect operations worldwide. General, any operation that relies exclusively on satellite intelligence, computer modeling, and standardized medical protocols without incorporating direct observational data and psychological awareness could face similar challenges. Modern systems are excellent for most conditions, but they have blind spots that can only be identified through field experience and interdisciplinary approaches. Blind spots that could prove fatal? Yes, ma'am. The meeting continued for another 3 hours, with investigators probing every aspect of the intelligence failure that had cost 7 aircraft. But the fundamental issue was already clear. The military's most sophisticated systems had been defeated by conditions that one dismissed officer had predicted and prepared for. As the session concluded, Colonel Blackwood approached Sara with an expression that mixed anger and desperation. Captain, I hope you understand the implications of what you've done here today. You've essentially accused this entire command structure of incompetence. Sara met his gaze steadily. No, sir. I've simply provided accurate information about operational conditions that proved critical to mission success. Information that you gathered through unauthorized means. Information that could have saved 7 crews if it had been incorporated into mission planning. Blackwood's face flushed with anger. Captain, your career at this base is finished. I'll make sure you never fly operational missions again. It was a threat, pure and simple. But as Sara looked around the conference room at investigators who were documenting systematic intelligence failures, she realized that Blackwood's threats might be empty. For the first time in 4 years, the truth was finally being heard by people who had the authority to act on it. The question was whether that truth had come too late to save the 7 crews who were still missing in Redstone Ridge. The courtroom at Arrowhead Base was packed beyond capacity. What had begun as a routine investigation into mission failures had evolved into a formal military tribunal that would determine the future of tactical planning procedures across the entire armed forces. Sara sat at the witness table, wearing her dress blues with the ribbons that told the story of her military career. Across the room, Colonel Blackwood was flanked by Pentagon lawyers whose presence suggested that this hearing would have implications far beyond one base commander's decisions. General Hayes served as the presiding officer, supported by a panel of senior military officials who had flown in from Washington. The atmosphere was tense with the kind of energy that preceded major changes in military policy. This tribunal is convened to investigate intelligence failures related to the Redstone Ridge mission of January 15th, General Hayes announced. We will examine systematic issues in operational planning that resulted in the loss of 7 aircraft and crews. The phrase systematic issues carried weight that everyone in the room understood. Careers would end today, and institutional procedures would be questioned at the highest levels. Captain Mitchell, the general continued, please provide your complete testimony regarding the intelligence you attempted to share with Base Command over the past 4 years. Sara opened her metal case and carefully removed the handwritten journal that had become the centerpiece of the investigation. The faded document looked impossibly fragile under the harsh courtroom lights, but its accuracy had been validated by Pentagon analysts who had spent weeks comparing her notations to satellite data. General, beginning in 2020, I submitted quarterly reports documenting atmospheric anomalies and psychological stress patterns in the Redstone Ridge region. These reports predicted the exact interference patterns and chemical effects that caused the mission failure on January 15th. How many reports did you submit? 17 reports over 4 years, ma'am. Each one was rejected by Base Command as inconsistent with official intelligence assessments and standard medical protocols. Colonel Blackwood's lead attorney, a sharp-featured woman in navy dress whites, stood to object. General, Captain Mitchell's so-called reports were unsupported personal theories that contradicted validated intelligence from multiple Pentagon sources. Commander Peterson, General Hayes replied, Captain Mitchell's personal theories proved more accurate than our validated intelligence. Perhaps you could explain why Pentagon sources failed to identify conditions that one officer documented with handwritten notes? The question hung in the air like smoke from a crash site. Peterson had just been asked to defend the entire military intelligence establishment against the demonstrated accuracy of one officer's personal observations. General, military planning requires validated intelligence from official sources. We cannot base operational decisions on individual theories, regardless of their eventual accuracy. It was the wrong argument to make in a room where 7 empty chairs represented the cost of ignoring accurate intelligence. Commander, General Hayes said coldly, are you suggesting that accuracy is less important than following proper bureaucratic procedures? Lieutenant Parker approached the witness table with a thick folder. General, I've prepared a comparative analysis of Captain Mitchell's intelligence versus official Pentagon assessments for the Redstone Ridge region. Your findings? Captain Mitchell's documentation is 96% accurate across all measurable parameters. Official intelligence assessments average 58% accuracy for the same region. In psychological stress response predictions, her accuracy rate rises to 99%, while standard protocols failed to predict any of the observed symptoms. The numbers echoed through the courtroom like artillery fire. The military's billion-dollar intelligence systems had been outperformed by one officer with a pressure gauge and careful observation. Captain, Colonel Blackwood's attorney interjected, how can you validate intelligence that was gathered through unauthorized methods? Parker turned to face the defense table. Commander, I validated it by comparing Captain Mitchell's predictions to actual field conditions encountered during the January 15th mission. Her documentation predicted atmospheric interference levels within 3% of measured values and accurately forecast all observed psychological symptoms. Official intelligence predictions were off by more than 400%. General Hayes leaned forward. Captain Mitchell, walk the tribunal through your attempt to brief Base Command before the January 15th mission. Sara consulted her notes. General, I requested permission to brief the mission planners on terrain conditions and psychological factors that could affect crew performance. Specifically, I wanted to recommend alternative flight paths that would avoid the most severe atmospheric anomalies and suggest protocols for treating potential chemical exposure effects. And the response? Colonel Blackwood informed me that my concerns had been noted, but that the mission would proceed according to established tactical planning procedures. Despite your documented experience in similar terrain with similar psychological factors, yes, ma'am. The prosecution called Master Sergeant Rodriguez as their next witness. The weathered maintenance chief approached the stand with the kind of confident bearing that came from 25 years of keeping aircraft airworthy. Sergeant Rodriguez, the prosecutor began, were you aware of Captain Mitchell's intelligence gathering activities? Yes, sir. Captain Mitchell would spend her personal leave time conducting observational flights over the mountain regions. She'd return with detailed notes about pressure patterns, psychological symptoms, and terrain conditions. Did you consider this unusual? Rodriguez smiled grimly. Sir, I considered it the sign of an officer who understood that people break down when you need them most. Captain Mitchell was preparing for the missions everyone else hoped would never happen. Did Captain Mitchell ever discuss her findings with other personnel? She tried to, sir. She'd brief anyone who would listen about the conditions in those mountains and how they affected both aircraft and human psychology. Most folks figured she was being overly cautious or too soft in her approach. Colonel Blackwood's attorney cross-examined aggressively. Sergeant, are you aware that Captain Mitchell's activities violated regulations regarding unauthorized intelligence gathering? Rodriguez looked at her like she'd asked whether water was wet. Ma'am, Captain Mitchell used her personal time and her personal expertise to study conditions that ended up saving American lives. If that's a violation, then I guess we need better regulations. The testimony continued for 3 days, with witness after witness confirming that Sara had repeatedly attempted to share intelligence that could have prevented the mission failure. Pentagon analysts testified that her handwritten journal contained information that didn't exist in any official database. Medical experts confirmed that her psychological intervention techniques had saved lives that standard protocols would have lost. The picture that emerged was devastating for Base Command. A veteran officer with critical intelligence had been systematically ignored because her methods didn't conform to institutional preferences and were considered too soft for combat operations. On the final day of the tribunal, Colonel Blackwood took the stand in his own defense. His testimony was professionally delivered, but couldn't escape the fundamental facts of the case. Colonel, the prosecutor asked, why did you reject Captain Mitchell's intelligence reports? Because they contradicted established assessments from Pentagon intelligence sources and medical protocols. Military planning requires validated information from official channels. Even when that validated information proved inaccurate, we had no way of knowing it would prove inaccurate at the time. But Captain Mitchell's reports proved accurate. Blackwood's composure finally cracked. Captain Mitchell's reports were based on personal theories and unvalidated observations. We cannot run military operations based on individual hunches and soft medical approaches. Individual hunches that saved 8 Marines' lives. That's not the point. Then what is the point, Colonel? Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, realizing that he'd been backed into a corner from which there was no escape. The point is maintaining proper chain of command and following established procedures. It was the answer that sealed his fate. In a room where 7 crew's deaths represented the cost of following established procedures, Blackwood had just admitted that he valued bureaucratic compliance over operational effectiveness and human life. General Hayes's verdict was delivered with the kind of precision that ended careers and changed institutional policies. This tribunal finds that the intelligence failures of January 5th resulted from systematic rejection of accurate tactical information due to institutional bias against non-traditional intelligence sources and psychological approaches deemed too soft for combat operations. The general's gaze fixed on Colonel Blackwood. Colonel, your command decisions prioritize procedural compliance over operational effectiveness, resulting in preventable losses of personnel and equipment. You are hereby relieved of command and recommended for immediate retirement. Blackwood's face went pale, but he remained at attention as his career dissolved around him. Captain Mitchell, Hayes continued, this tribunal finds that your intelligence-gathering activities, while technically outside established procedures, demonstrated exceptional initiative and provided critical information that prevented greater losses. You are hereby reinstated to full operational status with immediate promotion to major. The courtroom erupted in applause from pilots, medics, and support personnel who had watched the proceedings. For 4 years they had seen competence dismissed and experience ignored. Today, justice had finally been served. But Sara felt no satisfaction in Blackwood's downfall. 7 crews were still missing, and no tribunal verdict could bring them home. As she left the courtroom, General Hayes approached her privately. Major Mitchell, I have an offer for you. Pentagon Command wants you to head a new medical intelligence assessment program, one that combines traditional tactical approaches with psychological awareness. What would that involve, ma'am? Training officers to think beyond protocols instead of trusting blindly in standardized procedures. Teaching the kind of holistic awareness that saved 8 lives in Redstone Ridge. Sara considered the offer. It would mean leaving Arrowhead Base, abandoning the familiar routines of transport duty, returning to the world of operational planning and strategic decision-making. Ma'am, I'd like to remain here at Arrowhead Base. General Hayes raised an eyebrow. Major, this is an opportunity to influence tactical planning at the highest levels. You could prevent intelligence failures like this from happening again. Sara looked through the courtroom windows at the flight line, where young officers were conducting training exercises. General, the best place to prevent future failures is right here, teaching the next generation of officers that human beings aren't machines. That psychological care isn't soft, it's essential. Show them that treating the whole person is what brings everyone home alive. Hayes nodded slowly. Very well, Major, but I want you to establish a new training program, one that incorporates the lessons learned from January 15th. Show these young officers what real tactical awareness looks like. As the general left, Sara remained alone. In the empty courtroom, thinking about the 7 crews who hadn't come home. Their sacrifice had finally forced the military to confront uncomfortable truths about the limitations of technology and the value of psychological awareness. She opened her medal case one last time, looking at the handwritten journal that had become evidence in a case that changed military policy. The faded ink and worn edges told the story of preparation, persistence, and the kind of hard-earned wisdom that couldn't be programmed into computers. Tomorrow she would begin training a new generation of officers. But tonight, she would remember the ones who had been lost because no one wanted to listen to an old medic with a handwritten journal. 6 months after the tribunal, Major Sara Mitchell stood before a packed auditorium at Arrowhead Base, addressing the largest gathering of military medical personnel and tactical planners in the facility's history. Word had spread throughout the armed forces about the Redstone Ridge incident and its aftermath, drawing officers from bases across the country who wanted to understand how one dismissed transport officer had succeeded where the military's most advanced systems had failed. Ladies and gentlemen, Sara began, her voice carrying the authority that came from surviving what others hadn't. I want to tell you about the most important lesson I've learned in 20 years of military service. Technology will save your life right up until the moment it fails. Protocols will guide you perfectly until they become irrelevant. And the mind, when ignored, will defeat the strongest body. The auditorium was silent except for the scratch of pens as officers took notes. Behind Sara, a large screen displayed her handwritten journal alongside satellite imagery and computer-generated tactical displays. The contrast was striking, faded ink and careful handwriting versus high-resolution digital perfection. This journal, she continued, pointing to her weathered documentation, contains information that doesn't exist in any Pentagon database. Not because our intelligence systems are inadequate, but because some knowledge can only be acquired through direct experience and human connection. Lieutenant Kim, who had survived the Redstone Ridge mission with minor injuries after his aircraft was recovered 5 days later, raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do we balance reliance on established protocols with the need for psychological awareness?" It was the question that had driven 6 months of heated debate within military leadership. How could the world's most technologically advanced military incorporate lessons that seemed to contradict everything modern warfare represented? "Lieutenant, the goal isn't to choose between protocols and awareness. The goal is to understand that technology and procedures amplify human capability. They don't replace human judgment or human needs." Sara activated a presentation that showed comparative analysis of the January 15th mission. "Your C-130s are magnificent aircraft with capabilities that my older model can't match. But when atmospheric anomalies disabled your environmental systems, you needed skills that weren't part of your standard training. When chemical agents affected your patients' minds, you needed approaches that standard protocols dismissed as unnecessary." Captain Rodriguez, recently promoted after her own harrowing experience in Redstone Ridge, asked, "Ma'am, what specific skills should modern medical officers prioritize?" "Psychological first aid, atmospheric awareness, and most importantly, the ability to recognize when your instruments and your protocols are failing you. The strongest medicine sometimes isn't in your kit. It's in your capacity to connect with a frightened human being at 40,000 feet when everything is falling apart." Sara clicked to the next slide, showing chemical exposure patterns. "The mind breaks predictably under certain conditions. If you understand those conditions, you can prepare alternatives that standard protocols don't include." The presentation continued for 2 hours, covering everything from manual pressure regulation techniques to psychological intervention under crisis conditions. But the core message remained simple: preparation and experience trumped sophistication and confidence when everything went wrong simultaneously. After the formal presentation, Sara found herself surrounded by young officers eager to learn skills their instructors had dismissed as obsolete or too soft for combat operations. The irony wasn't lost on her. 6 months ago, these same officers had considered her outdated and irrelevant. "Major," a young lieutenant asked, "why didn't anyone teach us these psychological techniques during medical training?" Sara considered her answer carefully. "Because for the past decade, our technology has been so reliable that human factors seemed unnecessary. We forgot that the purpose of medical protocols isn't just to treat physical wounds, it's to bring whole people home alive." Lieutenant Martinez, Master Sergeant Rodriguez's daughter, who had recently graduated from flight medical school, approached with a question that struck to the heart of the issue. "Ma'am, how do we know when to trust our instruments and when to trust our instincts?" "Experience," Sara replied. "And until you have enough experience to make that judgment, you prepare for both possibilities." The new training program that emerged from the Redstone Ridge investigation was unlike anything in military medical history. The Mitchell Protocol, as officers had begun calling it, combined cutting-edge technology with psychological awareness, creating medical teams who could operate effectively when sophisticated systems failed and standard protocols became irrelevant. Every student learned to monitor atmospheric conditions that could affect both body and mind. Every training flight included scenarios where electronic systems were deliberately disabled while simulated patients exhibited psychological symptoms alongside physical ones. Most importantly, every officer learned to question their assumptions. When conditions suggested potential system failures, the results were dramatic. Within 6 months, medical teams trained under the new protocol showed significantly improved performance in adverse conditions. More importantly, they developed a kind of holistic thinking that could adapt to unexpected situations. But the real test came when Captain Rodriguez led a medical team into hostile territory, where enemy jamming had disabled communications for an entire battalion exposed to an unknown chemical agent. Using techniques learned from Sara's program, she successfully treated both the physical symptoms and the psychological effects that would have been catastrophic 6 months earlier. All affected personnel recovered completely. Manual intervention worked exactly as Major Mitchell taught us, Rodriguez reported during her debrief. We treated the whole soldier, not just the symptoms. The success of the new training program attracted attention from the highest levels of military leadership. Pentagon officials who had initially resisted changes to established procedures were now demanding expansion of the program to bases worldwide. General Hayes visited Arrowhead Base to personally observe the training program that had emerged from the ashes of the January 15th disaster. She found Sara in Hangar 5, working alongside students to prepare a C-17 for emergency psychological intervention drills. "Major, I have to admit something," Hayes said as they watched young medics practice manual pressure regulation techniques. "When I first read your service record, I thought you were a relic from an earlier era of warfare." Sara smiled, her hands busy organizing emergency psychological intervention kits. "General, maybe I am a relic. But sometimes old methods work, because they've been tested by people who couldn't afford for them to fail. The Pentagon wants to expand your training program to every base in the armed forces." "That's excellent news, ma'am." Hayes studied the organized chaos of students learning to treat psychological symptoms without computerized diagnostics. "Major, I need to ask you something directly. Do you believe we've become too dependent on technology and standardized protocols?" Sara set down her supplies and considered the question. "General, technology isn't the problem. Protocols aren't the problem. The problem is forgetting that we're treating human beings with minds as well as bodies. When we start believing that our systems are infallible and that psychological care is optional, we stop preparing for the moment when everything fails. And it will fail eventually, ma'am. The question is whether we're ready to treat the whole person when it happens." That evening, Sara sat in her C-17's medical bay, reading letters from families of the 7 crews lost during the Redstone Ridge mission. Some blamed her for not fighting harder to prevent the disaster. Others thanked her for ensuring that their sons' and daughters' deaths had led to changes that would protect future service members. The letters were difficult to read, but they reminded her why the new training program mattered. 7 families had paid the ultimate price for institutional overconfidence and dismissal of psychological factors. Her job was to make sure their sacrifice led to meaningful change. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached with his usual cup of coffee and a satisfied expression. "Heard the Pentagon wants to name the new training program after you officially. I'd prefer they name it after the 7 crews we lost," Sara replied. "Already suggested that. They're calling it the Sandstorm Protocol in honor of Operation Sandstorm and the January 15th mission." Sara nodded approvingly. The name honored both her traumatized unit, members from 2019, and the 7 crews from Redstone Ridge. It was fitting that a program designed to prevent future losses would carry the names of those who had died when preparation and psychological awareness were dismissed as unnecessary or too soft for combat. "Sergeant, do you think we've learned anything from this?" Rodriguez laughed, but it was hollow. "Ma'am, the military has a short memory for uncomfortable lessons. But maybe this time, enough people saw what happened when experience was ignored, and human factors were dismissed as weakness." As the months passed, the Sandstorm Protocol expanded beyond Arrowhead Base to installations worldwide. Young officers who had grown up trusting technology and standardized approaches learned to navigate by instinct and treat the human mind with the same urgency as the human body. Tactical planners who had relied exclusively on computer models began incorporating observational intelligence from experienced field officers. The changes weren't universal, and resistance remained strong among officers who had built careers on technological superiority and by-the-book procedures. But the success rates spoke for themselves. Teams trained under the new protocol performed significantly better in adverse conditions. More importantly, a generation of officers was learning that the most sophisticated instrument in any medical kit was the trained judgment of the person using it, and that treating psychological needs wasn't soft. It was essential to mission success. 1 year after the Redstone Ridge incident, Sara received a letter that changed everything. It was from Lieutenant Colonel Kim, now commanding a medical squadron in the Pacific Theater. "Major Mitchell," the letter began, "I wanted you to know that your training saved my entire squadron last week. We encountered a situation that would have been catastrophic a year ago, complete systems failure combined with a chemical attack that induced severe psychological symptoms in wounded personnel. But every medical officer knew how to intervene manually and treat the psychological effects alongside the physical ones. Every patient survived, body and mind intact. I realize now that dismissing your experience was the worst mistake of my military career. You weren't teaching outdated methods or soft approaches. You were teaching survival skills that our technology and protocols had made us forget we needed. The next time someone suggests that psychological awareness doesn't matter in modern warfare, I'll tell them about a medic who saved 8 lives with a handwritten journal and the wisdom to understand that human beings aren't machines." Sara folded the letter carefully and placed it in her metal case alongside the faded journal that had started everything. The case was fuller now, containing letters from officers who had been saved by techniques learned at Arrowhead Base, technical specifications for improved medical systems that incorporated psychological intervention procedures, and commendations from Pentagon officials who had finally understood the value of combining technology with human awareness. But the most important item in the case remained the original handwritten journal from Operation Sandstorm. The ink was more faded now, stained with antiseptic from multiple missions, but every line remained accurate. As she prepared for another day of training young officers who would carry these lessons to bases around the world, Sara reflected on the price of wisdom. 14 soldiers had been traumatized in Operation Sandstorm because the military hadn't been prepared for conditions that technology couldn't handle and minds it couldn't measure. 7 more crews had been lost at Redstone Ridge because institutional arrogance had dismissed the lessons learned from that earlier tragedy. But now hundreds of officers were learning skills that would keep their patients alive when everything else failed. They were learning that confidence was valuable, but preparation was essential. They were learning that the newest technology was worthless without the judgment to use it properly and the awareness that human minds needed treatment as urgently as human bodies. Most importantly, they were learning that sometimes the old ways were the only ways that worked, not because they were better, but because they had been tested by people who couldn't afford for them to fail. Standing on the flight line at Arrowhead Base, watching a new generation of officers practice psychological intervention techniques that might save lives someday, Sara finally felt that the weight of Operation Sandstorm had been lifted from her shoulders. The state-of-the-art facility represented everything she had fought for, a place where psychological intervention was taught alongside physical treatment, where human factors were considered as critical as technical skills. The building's main training hall was named after the 7 crews lost at Redstone Ridge, their names engraved on a memorial wall that greeted every student who entered. But it was the facility's motto, emblazoned above the entrance, that brought tears to Sara's eyes: "Heal the seen and unseen." Her words, once etched in secret on an aircraft that few appreciated, now stood as official doctrine for the entire military medical establishment. General Hayes, now 4-star General Hayes and chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, approached Sara after the ceremony. "You know, Colonel, when I first met you, I thought you were fighting a losing battle. The military doesn't change direction easily." Sara smiled. "No, ma'am, it doesn't. Yet here we are. Psychological intervention is now standard protocol. Your soft approach has saved more lives in 3 years than all our advanced technology did in the previous decade. It was never about being soft, General. It was about being complete, understanding that human beings aren't just bodies to be patched. They're minds to be healed. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. I've been reviewing the statistics. Medical teams trained under the Sandstorm protocol have a 94% full recovery rate, physical and psychological. That's 31% higher than our previous best performance. It turns out treating the whole person works better than treating just the wounds. Indeed. Hayes hesitated for a moment. There's something else. 2 days ago, our forward operating teams discovered wreckage in the northern section of Redstone Ridge. It appears to be from the January 5th mission. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The missing crews? Recovery operations are underway. Initial reports suggest there may be survivors. After 3 years? Sarah couldn't keep the disbelief from her voice. The ridge has deep cave systems. It appears some crew members may have found shelter and survived on their own for quite some time. Their rescue beacons finally penetrated to the surface during a geological shift last week. Sarah stood in stunned silence. The possibility that anyone could have survived 3 years in those conditions seemed impossible. Yet if anyone could do it, it would be military crews trained to handle the impossible. I want you to lead the medical response team, Hayes continued. If there are survivors, they'll need exactly your expertise, someone who understands both the physical and psychological toll of long-term isolation and survival conditions. When do we leave? Tomorrow at 0600. The mission has already been planned according to the Sandstorm protocol, with alternative routes, psychological intervention preparations, and full atmospheric monitoring. Sarah nodded, already mentally preparing. I'll be ready. That night, as she packed her medical kit, Sarah added the faded metal case containing her handwritten journal. The rescue mission would take her back to Redstone Ridge, back to the terrain that had claimed 7 crews, because no one would listen to experience over protocol. But this time, she wouldn't be fighting the system. This time, her methods weren't dismissed as too soft for combat. This time, the entire mission was built around the principles she had fought to establish. As she climbed aboard the C-17 the next morning, Sarah was met by a medical team that included Lieutenant Martinez, now Captain Martinez, and several other officers she had trained personally. Colonel, Martinez greeted her. The team is prepared for both physical and psychological intervention. We've studied your notes on long-term isolation effects and have structured our approach accordingly. Sarah smiled at the young officer. Captain, 3 years ago that statement would have earned you ridicule from half the command structure. Yes, ma'am. Things have changed, have they? Or have we simply remembered what we always knew but chose to forget, that human beings aren't machines, and treating them as if they are will always fail in the end? The flight to Redstone Ridge was conducted with meticulous attention to both atmospheric conditions and psychological readiness. The medical team reviewed not just physical treatment protocols, but psychological intervention techniques specifically designed for survivors of long-term isolation. As they approached the ridge, Sarah looked out the window at the jagged peaks that had nearly claimed her life twice. They looked the same, implacable, unforgiving, indifferent to human suffering. But she was different. The military was different, and that made all the difference in the world. The rescue operation lasted 3 days, conducted with the kind of precision that came from learning hard lessons through sacrifice. When they finally reached the cave system where survivors had taken shelter, Sarah was the first medical officer to enter. What she found inside would be etched in her memory forever. 5 crew members, emaciated but alive, who had survived 3 years by creating a micro-community in the depths of the ridge. They had adapted to their environment, created systems for water collection and food preservation, and most importantly, they had supported each other psychologically through the darkest moments of isolation. "We never gave up," the senior surviving officer told Sara as she conducted her initial assessment. "We knew someone would come eventually. We just had to keep each other alive, body and mind, until that happened. Body and mind." The words echoed in Sara's head as she worked. These survivors had instinctively understood what the military had taken so long to accept, that psychological survival was as critical as physical survival. As the survivors were transported back to Arrowhead Base, Sara observed something remarkable. Despite 3 years of isolation and deprivation, their psychological resilience was extraordinary. They had suffered, certainly, but they hadn't broken. They had created their own version of the Sandstorm Protocol, focusing on each other's mental well-being as much as physical needs. 2 weeks later, at the official debriefing, General Hayes asked the question everyone wanted answered: how did you survive when all protocols indicated survival was impossible? The senior survivor, now recovering in the medical center, answered, without hesitation, "Ma'am, with respect, the protocols were wrong. They assumed physical needs were primary. We learned quickly that the mind breaks before the body. We spent as much time on psychological support as we did on finding food and water. When someone started to lose hope, we intervened immediately, not as a soft approach, but as essential medicine." Sara exchanged glances with Hayes. Without knowing it, these survivors had validated everything the Sandstorm Protocol represented. That evening, as Sara updated her journal with observations from the rescue, she realized that her journey had come full circle. What had begun as a personal mission born of trauma had transformed an entire military culture. The distinction between hard physical medicine and soft psychological care had finally been recognized for what it was: an artificial division that cost lives. 1 month later, as the last of the Redstone Ridge survivors prepared to leave the medical center, Sara received a final letter from General Hayes. "Colonel Mitchell," it read, "the President has reviewed the Redstone Ridge rescue operation and the 3-year evolution of the Sandstorm Protocol. Effective immediately, you are being promoted to Brigadier General, with assignment as Director of the new Integrated Medical Command. Your vision of treating the whole person, body and mind together, has saved more lives than we can count. What was once dismissed as too soft for combat is now recognized as essential doctrine. Some leaders change what we do. The rare ones change how we think. You've done both." As Sara pinned on her star at the promotion ceremony, surrounded by officers who had once dismissed her approach and now championed it, she thought about the words she had etched on her aircraft so many years ago: heal the seen and unseen. What had begun as a personal reminder had become a revolution in military medicine. The artificial boundary between physical and psychological treatment had finally been erased, replaced by an integrated approach that recognized human beings as whole persons deserving complete care. Standing before the assembled officers, Brigadier General Sara Mitchell delivered a speech that would be quoted in military medical training for decades to come. "The greatest danger we face isn't enemy fire or adverse conditions. It's the assumption that human beings can be reduced to systems and protocols. Technology will always fail eventually. Procedures will always encounter exceptions. When that happens, what stands between life and death isn't the sophistication of your equipment or the perfection of your protocol compliance. It's your ability to see the whole person before you, body and mind inseparably connected, and to treat both with equal urgency. That isn't soft. That's smart. That isn't weakness. That's wisdom. And wisdom, my friends, is what brings everyone home alive when everything else fails." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.